What's up? Welcome back. This is the Changelog. This week we are talking to Adam Jacob, co-founder and CEO of System Initiative. They are out of stealth and ready to show you exactly how they plan to rebuild DevOps from the ground up. Of course, we had to have Adam on this show to go deep on this subject, so that's what we did. A massive thank you to our friends and our partners at Fastly and Fly, because this pod got to you fast because Fastly is fast, super fast, globally. Check them out at fastly.com. And our good friends at Fly, well, they help us put our app in our database, and they'll help you too, all over the world with no ops. Check them out at fly.io. Okay, before the show kicks off, I'm here with one of our sponsors at DevCycle, CTO and co-founder Jonathan Norris. So Jonathan, my main question, I guess, if I'm handing off my feature flags to you all, is my uptime dependent on your uptime? Like if you're down, am I down?
We've designed into all the SDKs and all the APIs. APIs fail, right? Like that's a cardinal rule of the internet. Exactly. It's slow or it's something, right? So all the SDKs have been designed with kind of defaults and caching mechanisms and all that stuff in place so that, yeah, if our CDN is down or our APIs are down, it'll sort of fall back to those defaults or those cache values in those SDKs. So that handles for those blips pretty easily. And then we rely on Cloudflare as our sort of main high load edge provider. So all of our edge APIs are through Cloudflare and they're also operating as our CDN for assets. So obviously, relying on a large provider like that runs such a large percentage of the internet means that, yeah, you're not relying on our ability to keep AWS instances running properly. You're relying on sort of Cloudflare and ability to sort of make sure the internet still works as they control such a large percentage of it. So yeah, we've architected it in a way that it doesn't sort of rely on our APIs to be up all the time and our databases to be up all the time to have that good reliability.
Well, that's good news. Okay, so how do you accomplish that?
One of the core sort of architectural decisions we made with our platform when we designed it was trying to move the decisioning logic of your feature flags as close to the end user and end device as possible. So we did that with those local bucketing server SDKs that are using sort of a shared WebAssembly core. And then we have edge-based APIs that are also powered by WebAssembly to serve sort of those client SDK usages. So things like web and mobile apps. So that's one of our core principles, is to try to get that decisioning logic as close to the end device as possible. And this is probably one of the only use cases where performance really matters, because you want your feature flags to load really, really quickly so you can render your website or you can render your mobile app really quickly. And so, yeah, we definitely understand that your feature flagging tool needs to be fast and needs to be really, really performant.
So if you want a fast feature flagging tool that's performant and is not going to impact your uptime, check out our friends at DevCycle. That's devcycle.com/changelogpod. And for those curious, they have a free forever tier that you can try out and prove to yourself and your team that this is going to work for you. So check it out, devcycle.com/changelogpod, and tell me I sent you.
Adam. So in September of 21, at the end of the last time we had you on the show, we said, come back when System Initiative launches. And you said, I'll dive as deep as you want. I'd love nothing more than to spend however long you want to talk to me being nerdy about it. Believe me, no one wants to tell the story of what that thing is and why it's amazing more than I do.
That's super real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here you are, nerd out with us, tell us the story. It's a couple years later, and you were already toiling for some time when we said that. So
yeah, it was not an easy thing to build.
What's been going on, man?
Yeah, well, System Initiative, now like a public thing. You can go learn what it is and watch a demo video, and you can come and like join the community. We're going to open source it soon. There'll be a little tracker. It can tell you like how close we are to open sourcing it. Basically, we need to add a couple of features before we're ready to open source it, but soon. And yeah, I'm stoked about it. And, it's basically we're trying to rebuild DevOps from the ground up and change the outcomes for what I think are kind of mediocre outcomes that the majority of us have sort of come to experience.
When you rebuild, do you demolish along the way? Do you obsolete things along the way? And if so, what dies?
Well, yeah, okay, look. So I suppose we should back up. Maybe I would trade straight to incendiary too soon. But like,
Yeah, wait a few minutes.
But I want to make it cool,
Rebuild from the ground up.
It is rebuilding it from the ground up. Here's
Yeah.
the thing. So I went back and watched John Allspaw and Paul Hammond's talk from 2009, the 10 deploys a day at Flickr. That was basically the moment that DevOps started, right? Patrick Dubois, I think, was in the audience, or at least saw the talk shortly thereafter. I think he was there. And that's sort of what led to DevOps. And, if you watch them give that talk, it's an amazing talk today. And they describe how they deploy Flickr 10 times a day. And the way that they deployed Flickr in 2009 is essentially exactly the way that we tell people to do DevOps today. Like the tools are completely different. We've replaced the tools 50 times. You've got a ton more options about like which thing slots into which part of the workflow or whatever. But that workflow, unchanged since 2009. You like put in some code, it goes into CI, at some point someone wangs a button, you do some feature flags, you do a little dark launching, right? Like you put it all in a blender, get some monitoring and observability. They were using Ganglia. Now you'd be like, I will use Honeycomb because observability is better than monitoring or whatever. Got some Datadog. But like essentially it's identical to what we did in 2009.
Yeah.
And the last DORA report talked about how there was like 88% of all the companies reporting can't deploy more often than once a week to once every 6 months. And like, that's insane. 14 years later, like 88% of us are stuck, can't deploy more often than once a week.
Wow.
And like, it's not because we didn't optimize each individual tool. It's not like you can point at a single tool and be like, oh, it's, whatever. It's Jenkins's fault, or it's like Chef's fault.
We try to do that though when we're mad, don't we?
Yeah, we try, but it's not, right? The truth is that what worked for us in 2009 in the small, when you say, now I want to extrapolate that same way of working to solve the problems of every enterprise on the planet, the problem was the system itself, right? The way that we interacted with it, the way we conceptualized how all the pieces come together, that's the reason that we're not getting the outcomes we want. It's not because we're not like DevOpsing hard enough. Do you know what I mean? Like nobody wants really, I think. People actually are now saying that they want to go back to a world that was more like devs do devs and ops do ops and never the twain shall meet. Because the experience of doing DevOps, the way that we conceptualized it in 2009, when you extrapolate it out to 2023, is kind of miserable. And so when I say we have to rebuild it from the ground up, I mean it in terms of like, I think the shape of the system as a whole is actually what's holding us back. And it's not... And our ambitions were the right ambitions to begin with. But our ability to actually achieve those ambitions, we now know that if you just sort of DevOps a little harder, swap one tool for another, but keep the basic shape the same, you're probably going to wind up deploying once a week, once every 6 months. It's going to kind of suck and you'll be kind of miserable about it.
What was the reason for this once a week with the DORA report? Did they cite why it was once a week? Like, what were some of the bottlenecks that made it once a week? I mean, we can deploy. I mean, we're a smaller team though, but what would make you not be able to deploy more than once a week?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's the complexity of the deploy. So if you think about like how you deploy the software, if you think about how the build pipelines work, if you think about how like, do you need to make changes to infrastructure? How do you get like how do you collaborate together on the infrastructure changes? How do you coordinate them together with the application deployment changes? What about your QA team? Maybe you have one. Does that mean there's like a lead time where they get to like bake in the software? There's a million questions like that where like we have answers, but once you glue it all together, it's quite complicated. If you've ever seen people use like an enterprise grade Terraform repository, that's like a lot of code. You know what I mean? It's not like an easy peasy thing. It's like a whole giant computer program that's like factored in a particular way. Slack had a post not that long ago where they have like I think it was like 1,000 plus state files that they were tracking for how they use Terraform at Slack. And so if you imagine as a developer trying to like influence, you wrote some code and it needs to change the way the infrastructure at Slack works. What do you do? Like, how's that work? Do you load that all into your head? Like, where's the collaboration? And the answer is in pull requests. Right. So maybe somebody told you, well, you have access to the repo. So, maybe go figure it out, man. Or they didn't give you access to the repo at all. And then you just had to go find somebody else to do it. But mostly we do it in code review. And like, code review is great, but like, it's not very collaborative, right? Like, you do the work and I review it. It's there in the name,
I submit it. I wait for you to review it. And then.
Yeah. And then you tell me if it's good or bad. You're probably wrong. You were busy when you reviewed it. Maybe you got it right. Maybe you got it wrong.
How dare you?
No, obviously your pull requests are always correct. But like, it's a real thing. And if you ask people how they feel about it, very few people will tell you that they love the experience of doing DevOps work. The user experience of it, the actual human, what's it feel like to do this? We're good at it. And we're proud of it. And it's unequivocally better than it was in 2009. So don't get me wrong. Like, if your choices are do it the way we do it today or do it the way we did it in 2008, all day, do it the way we do it today, all day. But like, is it good? I don't know. Like, not really.
Well, you're the kind of person, Adam, that looks at things from so many different facets. And I think you have a way to express your ideas well. And then you're also the kind of person to examine a system to say, okay, is this the right way the system should be? Obviously, system initiative makes a good sense in the name of the biz.
Yeah, suddenly the name makes sense. Yeah,
right. I think that's a good thing. So if we're rooting for somebody, it's you. It's you we're rooting.
Thanks,
for.
man. But I think actually we need to be rooting for us. I mean, more than anything, if you think about it, like what's amazing about DevOps is that it happened at all. Like basically the message that said operations people and software developers are the same. And we need to work together to create these outcomes that are better, not only for our day-to-day work and how we feel about each other and our personal experience of the work, but also for the businesses that we serve. And it's kind of amazing that cultural transformation is so widespread. Very few people, it's like what happened with Agile. Lots of people are maybe doing waterfall, but if you ask them, they'll almost all be like, oh, we're definitely doing Agile. Nobody wouldn't do waterfall, because the culture of Agile is so dominant.
Right.
That even if you're not doing Agile, you're doing Agile.
Because it's embarrassing to say what you're actually doing.
Yeah, because it'd be embarrassing to do anything else. And DevOps is kind of the same, right? Like you wouldn't say, no, we don't allow the ops people to talk to the devs. Like that's insane now. And it definitely wasn't insane in 2008, But I think what needs to happen in DevOps, I think, is we need this like second wave of DevOps tooling where people realize that the problem was systemic and that we need to actually build new solutions that change some of the fundamental rules of how these things worked. We made choices. John and Paul, I love, they're incredible, and so is everybody else that like influenced how we work. But like we just made choices based on what we knew and what we had and built the systems that we thought would work. And it's okay to realize that they didn't work the way we wanted them to in the end. And that what we need to do now is experiment again. Like now we need to actually go try new ways and be like, well, what if we did explore new ways to deploy applications collaboratively? What would a world where we could deploy applications, but we didn't require code review, but we still had all the same safety properties look like? I don't know the right answer to that question, but I want to, right? Like, I think that could be better, And I think once people realize, I hope people start to realize that we shouldn't give up on those aspirations that we had in 2009, that we were right. And the evidence that we were right is how pervasive that culture has become. And what we need to do now is live up to our own aspirations by being willing to do it, like being willing to actually do the work and create something fundamentally different than what we have now. Because right now, we kind of know what happens, right? Like if you adopt all these tools, whichever ones you choose, and you put them together roughly the way we told you to, you're probably going to wind up, 88% of you, deploying once a week, once every 6 months, right? Not collaborating super well. Like that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And we can do better. We should do better. We deserve better.
So when you started down your path
Yeah.
to where you are now with something to show, and you thought to yourself, we can do better, we should do better, I'm going to try something fundamentally different.
Yeah.
What was your starting point? What was your base premise or that you built from that said, this is going to be different. Here's where I'm going to start.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had two co-founders, Mihir Lupinacci and Alex Etier. And I think my starting place was that there was something wrong with the system as a whole. So that like insight that what was wrong was the way we did it. That was the whole thing, not just a single tool that was wrong. And I had some ideas around making the automation smarter, basically using like relationships and inference and constraints theory to like think about how we could infer more of the configuration instead of so much repetition. One of my co-founders had a background in visual effects. And so he had a lot of ideas around how the interface itself could be changed to serve us better, right? That if you thought about the way we deal with really complex, you know, the level of complexity that you see in like big video games, AAA video games, or those sorts of things, we have really powerful tools that are very collaborative with people across multiple disciplines working together to produce those AAA games. And the user experience they're having versus the experience that DevOps people are having is pretty dramatic, right?
You're talking about the people building the games, not playing the games, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, building the games.
I guess I'm not familiar with what tooling they have that's better than what DevOps has.
Well, if you think about like Unreal, or you think about like the way that you can collaborate on building scenes or building shaders or rendering, and you can like go from like a high level interface that like where you see all the relationships of all the different objects in a scene, but then you can also get down to the like C++ code
Right.
that actually makes that particular thing work. And you can do that dynamically in the same IDE. And you can't do anything like that in DevOps work, right? You're like in your editor writing code, then you run a plan, you hope it works, you apply it later. Like none of that is possible. And so a lot of where we wound up was really focused on the user experience and saying, okay, if we want it to be collaborative, if we want it to be more intelligent, how do we build a system that actually enables that to happen? And there's a bunch of stuff that sort of gets in your way. So some of it is like the feedback loops. You know, if you have to talk to the real AWS API or actually create the infrastructure to do something, that takes forever.
Slow,
right?
yeah.
So suddenly everything's slow. So if we want to speed them up, then the only way we could figure out how to do it was to basically build a digital twin and say, hey, even though this asset is digital, let's build a model of it that's like 1-to-1 and then simulate that model the same way that like a Formula One race car gets simulated, because we don't like tweak, you know, you don't like tweak the race car and then drive it and then tweak it and drive it. You like put it into a big model and you tweak it and you do a bunch of airflow simulation and like.
We saw this in Cars 3. They did that in Cars 3. It was a great simulator.
Exactly. The inspiration was Cars 3.
That's right.
There'd be no system initiative without, what was that little car's name that with the red race car with the bink, you know what I'm talking
The
about?
Italian one?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about the guy who was working on stuff? I don't know.
Anyway, I forgot all of their names, but
Lightning McQueen is the main
Lightning
character.
McQueen.
Well,
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's who you were looking for was the main character? Okay.
Well, he said Kachow.
Kachow.
He said like
That's
Kalink
right.
or something.
Yeah, no, Kachow. He's right. It's Kachow.
I don't know. I'm saying what you said, Adam, was
Yeah,
more
it
like,
wasn't right because it wasn't actually. I was like Kach. It was but it wasn't Kachow.
It was a caricature of what should have been true. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, it was a poor simulator, and so we could have given me. See, you gave me immediate feedback that my kaching was wrong and that it was in fact Kachow.
Right.
And so now I can adjust and do the right thing. And so System Initiative does the same by basically building this really full fidelity model of all the stuff that you use. And then we use that model to infer configuration. So we can say, hey, your model of a Docker image knows that this Docker image exposes a port number. Therefore, if you wire that up to, you know, a butane configuration to run on a Fedora box, then it'll automatically expose that port when it writes the systemd unit file for you that you need to boot that service. And like, you don't have to remember it anymore. And if you change the port number, it'll automatically get changed everywhere and you can watch it happen and sort of flow through this visual graph of all the configuration. It's super cool and much faster than doing it yourself.
Can we dive into the digital twin thing for a moment, into the weeds?
Yeah, man.
How do you build a digital twin of a moving target? I mean, it's got to be difficult like when your twin diverges from the real thing because
Yeah.
AWS is not a solid state service.
What a great question. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it moves slower than you think it does.
Okay.
So this comes back to some of the reasons that people tend to be less ambitious than they should be. You know, like when you think about when you look at something like AWS as a target, you're like, how could anyone ever cover off on all of these services that are in AWS?
Right.
And you're right, there's a lot of them. And also, they're not that hard, right? Like it's mostly documented. It's quite detailed. You can understand them. And yeah, it's going to take a minute to write all of the models. And also you can then refine the process of writing models. So for example, in System Initiative, one of the things we know needs to happen before we open source it is that you need to be able to write the model in System Initiative itself so that you can immediately just write the model, tweak it a little, play with it, tweak it, play with it, tweak it, and never have to leave the flow. And that makes creating models both fun and also not that hard. And the same thing's true with sort of extending them. So, yeah, it's a big list, but also it's kind of straightforward and they don't actually change as much as you think they do. So, if you look at the EC2 API, it's only really had a handful of dramatic changes over the years, right? We had new instance types, we had new stuff, but mostly it stays the same. If you look at the S3 API, it's gotten more complex, but mostly because they've added more objects and more things you can do around the core of the S3 API, right? That core API, kind of the same, So yeah, there's a lot to do there, but lots of people, some venture capital dollars.
Right. Throw money at the problem.
Next thing you know, you're, got a lot of AWS coverage, right?
Right.
How do you keep these digital twins in parity? When there is a change, how do you, institute that new change?
So you bake it into the system. So basically the idea, we have a schema that defines the digital side of the model. It also defines the sort of resource data. So the real world information about it. You track both. They're both true. So there's not a single source of truth. There's actually two. There's the simulation and then there's the real world, and you track both. And then what we do is let you reconcile between them, right? So choose which one is actually correct right now. And so you can go from, you can go from the world to the model or the model to the world, right? But you basically just make a new variation. So under the hood, the way this thing works is you can just imagine every configuration option and every action you can take is a function that's sitting on a graph. And it takes inputs from other parts of the graph. And then anytime the inputs change, the function runs. And then we take the output of the function and we store it as the output on the graph. So when you set a configuration value, there's what happens is we calculate all the inputs, then we take the output and write it. And so when you think about how you would then change over time, you're going to have all these schemas, which then people build variations of. And those variations might be because the upstream API has changed, but it could also be because you've been adding customizations on top of the existing thing. Because it's one thing to have a cool model. It's another thing to be like, hey, here in my company, we're only allowed to use these 3 AMIs. And if you can't launch a system with another one. So that's something you can encode in System Initiative in a qualification, and it would make a new variation of AMI, right? That is like the upstream AMI, but is now yours, right?
Sure.
And so that shape of easy, quick customization is built into the system so that you can just evolve the model as it makes sense in your environment over time.
Sounds like Lisp. Are you using Lisp?
It's not Lisp, but it does sound like, but I'm so glad you brought it up because it's actually probably even closer to Smalltalk.
Okay.
Cool.
So if you cast your mind back to the old Alto demos where they would tweak the way the Alto worked in the demo, right? There was that one where they had the bouncing ball or whatever. And then he
You're going way back now.
He edited the window and changed the code for the streaming thing so that now he could take single stills of the bouncing ball or maybe to animate it. I don't remember what the order was. The point was he changed the operating system in real time by clicking a button and being like, let me edit the source code for this part of the operating system.
Right.
And we just forgot that was a thing you could do. And so a lot of what's in System Initiative actually draws a very direct inspiration from that moment where I'm like, hey, what would be great in DevOps work? If anything I see that I need to change, I could just change the code
right,
without having to stop, which is exactly what it lets you do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's better, turns out that's super good. At least I think it's super good.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, thinking about just the surface area of some of these APIs, I now know why you've been working on this for so long. I mean, there's just a lot of work there, or was that a small percentage of the overall efforts?
It's actually, so there's not very much coverage right now.
Okay. So you're still
in System Initiative.
Okay.
A lot of what we have spent time on, like everything I just said, no one had ever built before this way, like I didn't talk about the fact that like that graph I just described, it also has built-in change control. So when you decide you want to make a change, it's not actually a graph, it's a hypergraph because it's n-dimensional. And so you can have a different function at a different moment in time, depending on your perspective, which is what you need, because part of what you do when you collaborate with other people is just like put up a whiteboard, and be like, well, I think it's this, or what if it was that, or what if it was this way? And sometimes you want to keep that and sometimes you don't, but you want to be able to do it in the same environment, right? As the one that you'll finally get the right answer in. And all of that is wickedly complex. Like, how do you build change control into this like hypergraph of functions that are all dispatched in real time? It's like a lot.
Just
it's complicated.
Maybe just fork Git or something. Just shove some Git in there.
Yeah, just fork Git. Except you can't, because part of how deep this rabbit hole goes is that once we decided, like, Git's beautiful for source code, but if you look at what the root cause is of a lot of the bad user experiences we suffer in DevOps work, it's source code. It's that it's words. It's that it's factored the way that it is. It's that it's not a digital model that I can ask questions about or interrogate or programmatically update. I can't do any of those things. All I can do is declare them, write them in some files, and hope.
Right.
I can see a textual diff of, Git will give me a textual diff of whatever it is I'm looking at.
Right.
But it can't tell me the impact, right? It can't tell me, hey, you don't want to restart the production database 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, because it has no way to know that that's a production database. It just knows that it's a block of code. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's no intelligence.
It's like a connection string to Git. It's like, here's your connection string.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a string. But I don't know. What do you put in there? Whatever you want. Get it? Did you get it wrong? How do you know? Well, I deployed and nothing connects anymore because I foobarred the connection string. But even that you have to know, like, well, what file is it in and how do I find it? And so like a lot of the effort that went into building System Initiative was really just the effort of just continually pulling on this thread and being like, oh man,
you have to build everything.
Yeah. If we actually want this to be better, you have to just keep tugging and be like, okay, yeah, well, nope, we can't make that feel good because this other thing is in our way. So I guess we got to rethink how that thing works so that we don't like lose all the good parts. Like if there was if there weren't integrated change sets in System Initiative and instead it was just like YOLO mode all the time, you would reject it immediately as a toy.
Yeah.
Right? You'd be like, oh no, I can't use this thing.
Right. We get fired.
Yeah. It'd be insane. So like, that's why it's taken so long, is that it can't just be one piece where you're like, hey, look at this cool toy I made where you can like, build a little diagram and it like does some infrastructure stuff for you. No, it has to be like a full-fledged power tool that actually like proves that you can do some complicated, hairy shenanigans with it.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Drata. Automate and accelerate your SOC 2 compliance, your ISO 27001 compliance, and many, many more compliance frameworks. With a suite of more than 75 integrations, Drata easily integrates with your tech stack through applications such as AWS, Azure, GitHub, Okta, and Cloudflare, and countless security professionals from companies including Lemonade, Notion, and Fivetran have shared how crucial it has been to have Drata as a trusted partner in the compliance process. They have deep native integrations that provide instant visibility into a security program and continuous monitoring to ensure compliance is always met. Drata allows companies to see all their controls, easily map them to SOC 2, ISO 27001, and many other frameworks to gain immediate insight into framework overlap. They are the only player in the industry to build on a private database architecture from day one, meaning your data can never be accessed by anyone outside your organization.
it is time to say goodbye to manual evidence collection and hello to automated compliance by visiting drata.com/partner/changelog. That's drata.com/partner/changelog. They are bringing automation to compliance at Drata speed. We're getting to the point where we're talking visual because you described diagram. We've had the pleasure of watching your 5-minute demo, which is essentially you're laying out a diagram that seems like a model of what should be infrastructure, and you're connecting Docker images and you're correcting them along the way, and you're choosing Fedora CoreOS and you're choosing EC2 and deploying, and this is a model. Can you describe as best you can what that diagram is? Do you call it a diagram? What is the interface for a system initiative? What was that demo?
Yeah, so it does sort of center around the idea that we struggle with what to call it. So yeah, we call it the diagram.
The diagram, okay.
But I'm sure it's going to need a better name.
Something, yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be other diagrams. We've called it a schematic in the past, but what's interesting about it is that essentially you need a way to think about the relationships between the models. So if we're building these full fidelity models. So we're not abstracting things from you. We're not translating them into a different domain. So if you know how Docker works, you know how the model works for Docker. If you know how AWS works, you know how the EC2 model works. And then visually, we're letting you create sockets essentially that have data that flows through them. And so you can connect the data about a Docker image to things that can use the data. So an example here is Docker images have a socket that exposes their port numbers. If you have port numbers that you've exposed in your Docker image, there's a socket that will take that data and emit it. And then visually, you can just connect that socket to something that takes it as an input. For example, an ingress rule in AWS that sets up a firewall rule that lets that traffic flow through. And then it will automatically translate between the shape of the data in the Docker image and the shape it needs for the ingress rule. Yeah. So in the Docker image, it's 80/TCP is the syntax. And then in the ingress rule, you need the port number, but they don't care about the protocol, blah, 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 blah. Right. And so when you think about doing all that stuff in code, it's actually kind of tough because you'd have to describe the relationships. How do you do it? What's the declaration look like? But if I just take all of what is fundamentally code in the end and I slap a visual interface on it, it's suddenly quite straightforward because you're like, oh yeah, I can click on this thing and drag to the other thing. The fact that behind the scenes, it's all software, it's all JavaScript functions and you can just call them and manipulate them. That's true. But it's a lot faster to just do it by putting them on the screen and connecting them. And it's certainly easier when you think about collaborating with other people because you can visualize it. You can see it and be like, well, this is what the architecture is and this is how it works. And it's kind of laid out that way. But it's mostly a diagram of configuration more than anything else.
Yeah. It's easy to go from that visual artifact to the code, which is sort of in the sidebar, but it's easy to go from, what would normally be YAML files essentially, or some sort of config files. Pick your battle. That visual interface is the natural way humans think anyways.
It is. And if you think about how then the YAML file gets generated, it's just another function. Its inputs are the object, right? As the model. Then we have a function that emits code. And you can generate it and write it yourself. So if the model needs to emit some YAML, you attach a function to it that emits it as YAML and maybe manipulates the data and gets it in the right shape or whatever in the middle. And then every time you change the information on that model, we automatically regenerate the code for you, right? So this is how we do things like populate user data in an EC2 instance, right? So you can go from a Docker image to the butane configuration, which then gets translated into a thing called ignition, which is a JSON syntax for configuring a Linux instance running Fedora CoreOS. And then that needs to get packaged up as user data, which is base64 encoded to get to the other side. Then all that just happens automatically for you because we've just written some functions that are like, yeah, whatever is in user data, base64 encode it, pack it in. Yeah. And then you don't have to remember to do it anymore. Right? It just sort of happens because it's in the model. It's pretty cool.
Sounds cool. Sounds like the opposite of what we have. So, we've been toiling on our system, and Gerhard has spent years experimenting, changing things, swapping out different component parts. And when he gets a nice system that he thinks works really well, he goes out and he painstakingly creates a diagram that shows the system. And it's like, this is just starting from the other way. You just start with the diagram, right? Or the schematic or the blueprint. Maybe blueprint's a cool word. I don't know. Blueprint's kind of overplayed. Like a lot of people say blueprint.
Exactly. That's why I didn't call it a blueprint. I'm like, if I call it a blueprint, everybody's going to be like, oh man, that's not a blueprint. And if I call it it is kind of an architecture diagram, but it's not. Like it is really a configuration diagram. It turns out that tends, the configuration relationships also tend to be architectural. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like those relationships tend to mimic the architectural layer. But one of the things that I think is most promising about the approach is that once all the data is in a model that's like a living thing, so instead of it being locked up in code, now we can start to add layers on top of that data. You can start to like imagine, oh, well, if we want to show an architecture diagram, why wouldn't we just allow you to express architectural relationships on the same components? Mm-hmm. And that could just be a different layer. It could be a different diagram. It could be a different way of viewing the same information, right?
You almost need a brand new word that's not currently used, like maybe something like ka-chow.
It's the ka-chow. That's what I'm going to call it from now on.
There you go.
Yeah.
Until you think of something, there's a good placeholder at least.
I'm CEO, so I get to do what I want, and it's
that's true.
I'm kidding.
Ka-chow.
It's not at all true. I have a team of incredible experts who
I was
will,
just agreeing with you because it sounded like it might be a good idea.
no, they'll 100% stop me from calling it the ka-chow, but
Okay.
Well, when I was watching this demo and I was seeing you kind of lay this system out from start to finish, and then you said, okay, this is a working model because you can see the relationship between, okay, this would work on EC2 or this Docker image would not because it doesn't support X. And then you made some changes. That all seemed very logical as you were going through it. And I think at the end, if I understood it correctly, you clicked some sort of button and it was like just like the button just basically said, make it true. And then boom, it was in real life.
Yeah.
And you went to the CAT website and there you go.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
That to me seems very logical, but what are the components in there that make it so hard to pull off that visual to reality? Like the relationships and the communication and the interoperability, et cetera.
So, I mean, the big one is separating out the sources of truth. So infrastructure as code taught us that there should be a single source of truth and that the source of truth for that should be the code. And there's a bunch of reasons why it does that, but the biggest one is actually that there's no way to do it the other way anyway, because when human beings write code, we write code and then we refactor it, we structure it differently, we put it into modules, we add all these semantics to it that you can't just serialize and deserialize, right? It's more than just the YAML. It's where's the YAML on disk? It's how's that YAML relate to the other files on disk? How's it get committed to the repository? There's like a lot of information in there. And so when you imagine trying to go from a real world thing to the code, you can do it. Like there are projects that like generate you Terraform or generate Pulumi or whatever, but you don't live in those projects. You do them once and then you tweak them so that they make semantic sense to you, right? And so when you think about how you apply that stuff to the real world, you think of it as a reconciliation process where you say, well, I have this model that's trying to be as full fidelity a thing as it can be of the way that whatever the thing I'm dealing with, the AWS instance, the EC2 instance I'm dealing with, for example, thinks about itself. And the closer those two things are together, the easier it is to go bidirectionally between them, right? It's easier to say, well, I don't have a resource that exists in AWS that I can find that looks like the one you've described. Therefore, the action you should take is probably to create the EC2 instance. And those can just be, again, functions on the graph. So like if the model, for example, doesn't have a resource attached to it, then most likely the action to take is creating it. But in the case of an AWS instance, if you update the tags, for example, on that EC2 instance, what you probably want to do is call the tags API to just update the tags. You don't probably want to destroy the EC2 instance and create a new one just because you wanted to update the tags, right? That feels wasteful. So that's a different kind of function that would then look at an existing resource and go, oh, hey, I see that you do have a resource. If I look at the model and I look at the resource, the tags aren't the same. Now I have to let the user choose, what do you want to do? Do you want to update the tags in the model so they're reflective of the real world? Because maybe somebody logged into the AWS console and just fixed the tag because they had a problem. and that's actually the right set of tags. So in System Initiative, you can just say, well, update the tags on the model. So now the model matches and we're cool. Or it could be that they're the wrong set of tags, that like you in fact have updated the model and the model is correct. And what you need to do is change the world by updating the tags. And all of that basically can happen relatively easily because we've turned it into a problem of reconciling the data and then taking action as opposed to having to declare the correct state up front.
So in System Initiative, where does this graph live?
I mean, in System Initiative, in Postgres.
Yeah, but what's that mean? Okay.
It's like, yeah, in a lot of ways, it's inside of the database and then in some Rust code. And then if you actually dig into the architecture, a lot of System Initiative is like old techniques applied in new ways. So like there's a lot of very like dope stored procedures that like actually work on a lot of this data, or like the way change sets work are baked into the database and through stored procedures.
That's actually a kind of a cool tagline, like powered by dope stored procedures under the hood. You know?
Kinda, you know, and like we built versions of it in every possible way before that was the one we built. And it turned out that it was just too hard to work with until you made a database that was essentially feels custom from the outside, because you interact with it mostly through these stored procedures that handle all of this bookkeeping of like, okay, you want to run this function because these inputs have changed. What's the calculation for what the inputs are? How do I know they've changed? How do I decide which other functions to run? Like they're all in a database and you can query the database and it'll tell you.
So you tried other databases than Postgres, is what you're saying?
Yeah. Oh, I tried every possible version of not putting it. The last thing we tried was putting it in stored procedures because like, right?
Yeah.
That's not a thing you normally want to do.
If you can avoid it. Yeah.
But like, it's the one advantage of being 45 is that like I was working when we did that, you know, like I worked with DBAs.
You're not afraid of it. You're just like, yeah, we can do this.
Yeah. I was like, you know what would work?
Right.
Is like, what if we just put it in the database and then did it that way? And it did work and it was great. And go figure. But, you know,
I actually think we're going to start trending back towards put it in the database. I'm starting to see it already. So this might help in that way. Like, hey, Adam Jacob got away with it. Because, we go away from it and we come back. That's what we do in software. We swing the pendulum.
Wasn't there something recently we were going to do to put it in a database? Was it like a cache or something like that?
Yeah.
Is that worth sharing a micro story version of that? Like just to commiserate with Postgres and...
Well, I'm just putting some data in there that is probably unwise. He's putting code in there.
Right.
So a little bit different.
Well, the code's in there, but it's also data.
Yeah, sure.
So like the actual execution of the function is not in the database. It's like that's out. There's like a whole separate subsystem that knows how to do that for you. But all the bookkeeping about like what to run.
Just one big eval, basically.
Yes, exactly. It's just
you're just evaling our JavaScript at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm just running it all in the browser through eval. That's the answer.
Don't put that on the tagline. Yeah.
System Initiative powered by stored procedures and eval.
An eval. Yeah.
Dope.
I mean, you get some hacker credit.
Dope stored procedures.
It's not wrong.
Like,
all right. So let's imagine that I'm coming to System Initiative. You know, I go down to Circuit City. I'm going to buy one. Like,
yeah, you're going to buy a System Initiative.
I'm going to buy myself a System Initiative. What part of my infrastructure am I replacing, or like what do I not need? Because there's still a lot of like components that you're talking about Docker. I know you're talking about Kubernetes. You're talking about blah blah blah.
So by design, we're trying to meet people where they are. So, you know, one of the things that is hardest about adopting new DevOps tooling is that in general, it sort of forces you to throw away what exists. So today, it's still pretty early on. And so some of these features we've had working in earlier prototypes, but we sort of stripped out in order to get it shipped. But one of the great things about being able to go bidirectionally is that you can start from your existing infrastructure and build a model from there. So rather than onboarding being, hey, rebuild all your stuff in System Initiative, in a not too distant future, we want that to just be, give us your AWS credentials. We'll look at everything that's in AWS, and then we'll build a model backwards based on what you have. And then if you think about the bidirectionality of it, if that model, if those resources were built by Terraform or by Pulumi or whatever, CDK, like you can keep doing it that way. And what System Initiative is going to do is notice that they changed every time you run it. And so it's just going to be like, hey, you want to update the model? And you're like, yeah. And now you can visualize it and see it and you can keep doing it. But then you're probably going to be like, you know what would be easier than futzing around in this Terraform module? Like I could just maybe click on the instance that I want to reboot and say reboot, and then hit the apply button, and then it would do it. And then you could see it happen, and it would just happen visually. So the goal is more that than it is like rebuild all your stuff around system initiative. I think the number one thing that it changes for now is that sort of infrastructure as code layer. So if you think about all the things that go into doing infrastructure as at code well and at scale. So, you know, when you think about how do we actually define it? How do we collaborate on it? Do we need deployment pipelines? Do we need, you know, reviews, all that stuff? We're streamlining all of that stuff first, partly because it's the world that I know best. And also because when you really look at where the pain is in the DevOps workflow, a lot of it's right there, you know, like that's actually where a lot of the paper cuts live right now. Not because those tools are garbage, they're not, but just because the way how they fit into the systemic workflow, the overall arc of what we do, it causes a lot of downstream problems.
Is this the death of GitOps?
I mean, I hesitate to say it's the death of anything, because like I'm full of hubris, right? Like I got plenty of ego, and I even have some aspirations around like feeling more confident in my own ego, if that makes sense. So like I'm more than willing to be like, no, I'm great at this. But like, is it the death of it? Like,
well, let me rephrase. If this is successful, is this the death of GitOps?
If it's successful, you won't need it.
Okay, it's the death then.
What else won't you need?
Well, you won't need infrastructure pipelines anymore. You won't need continuous integration pipelines. None of that for your infrastructure you will need anymore. It'll all be done real time. You won't need pull requests and code reviews. Instead, you'll replace them with, like, think about it this way. If we know that the model, none of this is like, this is all stuff we're going to build. Yeah.
We're aspirational now.
This is all aspirational.
Right.
So just so we're clear, I'm not saying you can come do this stuff right now. If you think you can, you're going to be disappointed. But this is what we're building for. And we know it will work because we've built prototypes that worked this way. So like, you know, you can say like, imagine that you need a DBA or someone, let's say I need a DBA and a principal engineer to approve any change that requires rebooting the production database. And so, you know, Jared and Adam go and whip up a change that requires touching the production database that's going to require the action rebooting it. So rather than just being able to apply that action immediately, instead of pulling it into a PR, we can just use the data about the impacted objects and say, in order for this to be applied, you need the real-time permission from these 4 people. And then they can just log into System Initiative and in real time join your change set and see the screen that says, hey, Adam and Jared, this is what they want to do. Here's all the things they said. Like, they want to do it right now. Say yes or no. And it's a little more like submarine captains launching nukes, which is a weird analogy, and I'm sorry I used it, but I like don't have a better one, and it feels really evocative from, you know, like one ping and only Vasily, you know?
Requires like 2 keys, right? It's like
you gotta
turn at the same time.
Right.
It requires synchronization.
Right, Star Trek self-destruct sequences or whatever.
It's not async. Yeah,
no.
This is a synchronized action.
Because it's about collaboration again. Because if the DBA is like, why do you got to reboot my database? Like, you actually don't want him to ask you that in a PR. You want him to just say it to your face, right? And so you can just literally look at the interface and be like, say it to my face. Just,
this is why.
This is why.
And this makes sense. So yeah, sure.
And so like all those things could start, you can imagine all those things sort of fading away. The same thing around like when you think about like continuous delivery pipelines. So the way we talk about application delivery today is often through a series of activities we take on infrastructure, right? You're like moving something somewhere, you're building a new thing, you're doing that kind of stuff. Like, what if we turned those into workflows that you could collaborate on and then trigger with inputs as part of the API? So instead of having like a continuous delivery pipeline that defines all those things outside the flow, what if they were just calls to models that said, find all the models related to this thing and call this action on them, and then we'll trigger it under this trigger, right? So like over time, the ambition is to rebuild the whole shoot and match. Like the whole thing could work differently. And if it worked differently, it would be better. And it's ambitious and nutty. And also, we're not wrong. Mm-hmm. Like it is in fact better. And you can see that it's better already. It's just going to take a lot of people and effort and time to understand like all of those suggestions. They might be better, but no one's tried them. Like we know all the ways that code review is bad. We know all the ways that the existing process fails us. We don't know what the alternatives are when you really try to use them at massive scale. And so we got to figure that out together.
Well, you said together, and I've been thinking a little bit about community because you have a long tradition of open source and open things in community. You have Chef in the back pocket. You're 45 now, so you have lessons learned the hard way, the easy way. And you get a chance to restart, right? Like you're launching a new thing now. What are you doing differently, or what are you thinking about differently that hopefully will be better or successful with System Initiative?
I mean, in terms of open source, like a big one is that it's not open core and it won't ever be because I think that model sucks to execute. Like it's just no fun on the inside. And I don't think it's better for your community. But B, like I just went on this whole ambitious rant about like rebuilding the entirety of the DevOps workflow from scratch. And like, that's not a thing you do alone, right? Like that's only a thing that happens because other people are like, yeah, I agree with you. Like, I think that it could be better and I like your groove, right? And whether they like System Initiative or not, I hope what it inspires people to is to like break a bunch of rules. Like we need to build more wacky stuff because we need to see if it works. And we're kind of not doing that right now. We're building a lot of variations on the theme. And like, I want to see a second wave of DevOps that's full of new, interesting stuff. And so part of what we're doing is open sourcing all of System Initiative. So it's the Red Hat model. It's the same as what Chef's model was in the end. So every single piece of software that we use in System Initiative, all of the System Initiative software is open source. And what you're not going to be able to do is make a distribution of it and call it System Initiative. Only I get to do that. And that's it. And we're doing that because I can't invite people to explore what's possible with me and to see if this new way is better while simultaneously telling them that I'm the only person who's allowed to make money off of it, or I'm the only person who's allowed to better my life in the way I want to with it. Like I can say that, but what it means is it's not actually about the outcome. It's about me. Does that make sense? Like it means it's about whatever, the money in my pocket, which it is. Like I want money in my pocket. I think I said that on one of these podcasts earlier. Like
yeah, you have.
I got no shame about it.
That's totally cool, right?
It is great. It's a lot better to have money than not to have money. Like I think anybody who tells you otherwise is wrong, but it's not the only reason to do it. And our ambition for it is a big one. And you can't really think about how to get there. It's impossible really to me to imagine how to get there without building a giant community of people who share that point of view. And if you want that to happen, I can't simultaneously believe that and also say, but here are all the ways you can't make your life better, right? If it involves you making money in the way I want to make money, I don't like that. Or if it involves you doing anything I don't like, you're not allowed. Or if you disagree with me in some fundamental way and you're like, Adam's totally wrong. What System Initiative needs, what the System Initiative software needs is to work with Git. Then, you got to be able to fork System Initiative, make the Atom Initiative, and like, which you shouldn't call it the Atom Initiative because I'd come find you and be like, that's too close to my trademark. But you know what I mean? You can call it LaCroix or whatever, let them sue you and make it work with Git, Yeah.
Get more specific with the Red Hat model. What do you mean when you say, like, for those who don't know the details of the Red Hat model, what does that mean for how the software gets distributed, used, deployed, how you make money from it, how you hold a trademark over it, the name? Break that truly down in practical terms.
All right. So there's 3 levers in sort of open source business models. There are no open source business models. Open source isn't a business model, blah, 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 blah. Let us just admit that that's true. And then we're going to go on calling it open source business models because that's just what you have to do. So open source business models, 3 levers: copyrights, trademarks, patents. All 3 of those things are like, you can think of them as just ways that you create scarcity. So, and then in order to get people to pay you for things, there needs to be scarcity. So you don't tend to pay for things you can get for free is the way to think about it, right? So the one people are most familiar with is copyright. So we say, hey, I made System Initiative, therefore you can't have it unless you pay me money. And if you think it's valuable, you pay me. If you don't think it's valuable, you don't. No harm, no foul. That's the copyright lever. The trademark lever says only I am allowed to make System Initiative and call it System Initiative. And if you want to build something similar and also call it System Initiative, you can't, because that's my brand. That's the thing I do. That's how I make money. That's my brand promise. And then patents are the third, where you can be like, hey, we do this in a novel way, and nobody but us are allowed to do it in this novel way, because if you try, we'll find our little patent and we'll be like, waggle our finger at you and be like, you can't do it because, my patented algorithm says you can't unless you pay me money. So most open source business models hinge on copyright. They say, by keeping some amount of features proprietary, and so you can't have them without paying me money, then I find someone who's willing to pay for those features, and they do, and therefore we're happy. Or you say, hey, here's my SaaS, and I'll run that here, but I'm the only one who's allowed to, blah, 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 blah. Lots of shenanigans sort of around copyright. So the Red Hat model says, okay, the actual value, the value people get is in products, not in software. So when you buy a product, like, for example, when you record this podcast, y'all want us to record a separate audio track just in case the one we're doing right now doesn't work. And I'm using Audacity to do it. And it's not a very good product. And so it is. I'm so sorry, Audacity people.
Gosh.
Oh no, I just really made a boo-boo.
Provided a lot of value for a lot of people.
It's providing a lot of value for a lot of people, but I really struggled to get it to work. Yeah, because I don't use it very often.
It has challenges.
It has some, right. I'm so sorry, Audacity people. It's great. And it's working for me. God bless it. But right now. So if you think about that software, it's valuable to me because I could get it and just use it. But my mom, not so much, right? If I threw Audacity in front of my mom, not good. But my mom could use Riverside, which is the platform we're using that records this podcast, because you basically log into Riverside and talk, and then it's all done because the product is better. And it's not just the software. If I gave my mom the Riverside software, that's not better for my mom. She's like, it should be like, how do I run Riverside? And you're like, well, you launch this service and this one. Don't forget to configure the S3 bucket you stream to, and all this stuff you got to do. So products are the full experience that someone has around getting the value that they desire, right? And it's not just the software. The software is a big piece of it, but it's not all of it. And what Red Hat does is say, yep, we sell enterprise products for money, and we build them primarily out of open source software. So Red Hat makes $1 billion in ARR on top of Kubernetes selling OpenShift. Every single thing you get in OpenShift is open source. You can have it for free right now. They make $1 billion a year with a B. $1 billion a year.
Gosh.
$1 billion.
Whoa.
Right? $1 billion. And HashiCorp, they don't make $1 billion a year. That's a public company that is the incredible success story. Nowhere close to $1 billion a year in ARR. Nowhere close. Why? Well, Red Hat takes software and sells it for money exclusively. If you would like the product that is OpenShift, the vetted experience that comes with Red Hat, there's only one way to get it, and it's to pay them. Feel free to take all the piece parts and try to cobble together some OpenShift yourself. God bless and keep you. And some number of people will. And that's great for them because it keeps you in Red Hat's ecosystem. You don't leave Red Hat's ecosystem even when you don't want to pay Red Hat. You're still there because they provide so much value in the software that even when you don't want to pay them, you're still hanging out using their stuff. And that's such a better competitive advantage, right? Because now you're not competing on a closed source basis. You're not competing on your software's specialty. You're competing on the experience of what it's like to receive it. And the people who have the most money and will see the most value in what we build tend to be people who need the experience to be better, and they're willing to pay for it. And so that's the business model. And it's better because you don't hold anything back from the community. It's better because it's more straightforward to execute because the business model is really easy. We build System Initiative and we sell it for money. That's the business model. Mm-hmm. And if you want it from me, depending on what you need, you have to pay me.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to pay me, that's fine. You can use the software. Now, you might have to get that software from somebody who's not me because I produce that software to sell it for money. But that's cool. You don't mind because you don't want the product from me anyway.
Yeah.
Because to get it from me, you got to pay for it. Yeah.
So in the future, when it's open source, I'll be able to download or do something with
All of it.
System Initiative, and I put it on my own server, and I have to orchestrate it and fine tune the database and make sure the database works and the APIs are all working.
And you got to call it something else. You got to remove all my branding.
Well, no, I don't have to if I'm just using your thing there. I'm using it for me.
Just to run it?
Right.
Nope, you can't get it from me. If you want to run System Initiative, you have to get it from me under my commercial terms. Now, my commercial terms will likely be incredibly easy for you to get it for $0. So for example, you do this every day with VS Code. VS Code, the thing you download, is not open source. That is a commercial piece of software that happens to be $0 and you don't even notice. So for some huge number of people, System Initiative will be basically $0, right? But then for other people, it won't be.
Okay.
Because VS Code that you download is packaged and wrapped by Microsoft and therefore, quote unquote, sold by them.
Using the VS Code trademark and a distribution license to change the terms on which you get that distribution, even though every line of code in VS Code is open source. Right?
Right.
Okay.
And so there are people that will take the VS Code open source stuff and they'll repackage it with a name like
VS Codium.
Yeah, exactly. And they'll do what you're talking about, Adam.
And they totally get to. What they don't get to do, though, is use Microsoft's extension store. Because Microsoft builds like services that make VS Code better. And the only people who get to use those services are people who use VS Code. And that's likely the same thing that happens with System Initiative. Like there's services that make System Initiative work that like that everyone who's using System Initiative uses. Those services are open source. You can take them, you can run your own versions of them, you can do whatever, but the data that's in there doesn't come with them. You know what I mean? Like those things aren't. But we'll work with people to do it. Like if that's what needs to happen, like I'm down to collaborate. Like I want System Initiative in the world. I want it to succeed. I want that software to win. I think it's better. So, you know, when those things come up, we'll cross those bridges when we come to them.
When you explain it, it makes total sense. But then when I walk away and try to tell somebody else about it, I'm always like, you see, it's free, but you still pay for it.
You see.
And they're like, why? Like, because you like what they're putting out there.
The struggle is that you start by saying it's free. It's not free.
Well, you know what I mean.
But I do, but this is why I'm telling you, this is how you solve your problem, man. I'm helping you get through this as a brother.
Okay, I appreciate that.
And what you got to do is just say, like, it's not free. The software is open source. Like the software. But the product's not free.
You have to differentiate between the product and the software.
That's right. And we buy products. And it's important that the software is open source. It's important that the software is free because this is software that, if it's successful, runs the world. And it's better. Everything I know in my career happened because people open source their software, and I got to understand how it worked by looking inside of it and figuring it out and munging it and doing all of that. It's incredible. And like, it's a unique thing that software can be not a zero-sum game in this way. And the thing you just have to believe as a business person is that sometimes the products we build are best served by not being zero-sum games. That like that the path for them to become most successful in the world, and for then therefore my business to be as successful as it can possibly be, is actually that it go out in the world and just be valuable to whoever it needs to be valuable to in whatever way they find that value. And the more you try to constrict it, the worse you make it. And I think it's better. And the hard part is that most people don't actually believe what I just said. In the end, if you push them, they believe that because they built it initially or because it was their idea, that they deserve more. And like, I don't think I deserve more. I think I'll wind up with more. I think that's probably real if I'm a good steward of it and I take good care of it and I do the work of building a great company and finding incredible people and putting them against that problem and building a big community. All that stuff will bring good things to my life, unquestionably. But that doesn't have to be at the expense of other people's ability to do the same thing.
Does a license matter in this scenario? Like, do you choose a particular license to ensure the war for the soul of open source survives this this initiative you're on?
Thank you, Salil. You know, I think that was a joke. That was a deep cut.
I didn't catch it.
MongoDB
Okay.
wrote that blog post with the soul for the war of open source or whatever.
Okay.
That's totally going to get edited out of this podcast. Okay, so
Nope, it's in there.
Nope, it's in there forever now. It's who we are. Okay, so I think I think one of the things that happens here is you I've totally lost the plot now because I'm thinking about how it's not being edited out.
Licensing.
Yeah. So the Apache license is particularly good for this model because it's very explicit about not granting you any trademark licensing. And so when you look at licenses like the MIT license, which is also a good liberal license, it doesn't say anything one way or the other, which most lawyers will be like, means you don't have those rights. But lots of humans on the internet will be like, but you don't know, and then you just wind up in all these ridiculous arguments about what people can and can't do. So I like the Apache license quite a bit for this. I think the MPL would also work just fine for it. I think if there's a piece of you that really loves the GPL, then go, get on with your bad self. Lots of GPL software and Red Hat products, right? So if that's what grooves you, like, go for it. But
so do you Apache license across the board then in this case, since this best fits? So all of the open source system initiative produces will be AGPL.
Yeah, not AGPL, Apache license.
Sorry, Apache.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the only things that maybe won't be are like the code. Like we're gonna run managed services, we'll run SaaS services, we'll do that stuff. So like the code for us to like run those services, we probably won't open source it, but it will be. If we need it to be, you know what? Like if it's better for our engineers, if it's better for the way we build it, then like I wouldn't necessarily hold those things back. I don't believe that I'd have to hold them back in order for the product to be valuable. I just think it's just weird to imagine how you would in a way that allows you to do the things you need to do safely and securely. And like, it just gets weird.
I'm Jared, and this is a changelog news break. Device Script is Microsoft's new TypeScript programming environment for microcontrollers. It's designed for low power, low flash, low memory embedded projects, and has all of the familiar syntax and tooling of TypeScript, including the NPM ecosystem for distributing packages. This project has a lot of devs excited. Jonathan Berry says, quote, "Dope. TypeScript for hardware. Always glad to see these attempts at bringing web technologies to embedded systems and see what sticks. Even when they don't, they inspire innovation." Zach Silveira says, quote, "This is so much better than MicroPython." And Andrea Guiamarchi says, quote, "This is the first Esperino competitor, and I think it's going to be huge." You just heard one of our 5 top stories from Monday's Changelog News. Subscribe to the podcast to get all of the week's top stories and pop your email address in at changelog.com/news to also receive our free companion email with even more developer news worth your attention. Once again, that's changelog.com/news.
Does things like development environments in the cloud play a role in system initiative in the future? If you're doing more things in this sandbox, this toy box, this hypothetical that could be true, that maybe mirrors true or gets sucked in as mirror of a true, is that a thing in the future?
Yeah, it is in many ways a dev sandbox in the cloud already, right? The IDE is built into the product. Like that stuff is kind of already there. So it definitely draws inspiration from those things. We'll see what the future holds in terms of like bringing your own IDE or like some of those sorts of pieces. It's hard to imagine how you make that user experience as good as you want it to be, because so much of what you're doing is this like tight iteration between tweaking some code and then seeing it happen in the product. And then like how tight that loop can be is really important. So I don't know, like we'll see what that is. I think it's going to be like the number one thing people bring up. They're going to be like, can I write all this code in my own IDE? And the answer's going to be like, maybe.
Yeah. Well, are you constraining this to like infrastructure code, or is this like all the code in your system?
Infrastructure code for today. Yeah. Because it feels a little nutty. And I'm not sure that as an application developer, I actually find the experience of writing modern applications quite delightful. Like as an application developer, I'm not suffering like infrastructure operations developers are suffering, right? It's pretty good. Like my IDE is kind of great. I'm getting incredible AI assisted search, and they're like, it's like things that are happening for software developers where the outcome is software. Like that experience is pretty on point right now.
Yeah.
But boy, the infrastructure side isn't.
Yeah. I was just trying to see the scope of your ambitions there, because as you're talking about like a new change control system, collaboration built in, all these other things, you start wondering like, well, if it's source code at the end of the day,
yeah,
and all these things are like great, then maybe it also eventually can replace other things that we know and love. But
how weird does it get? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I really want to find out. But like one way to think about it is you could think about the application source code as an input to the hypergraph.
well, it's got to get in there somehow, right? Like that's what ultimately gets deployed, right?
Yeah. So if you think about it as an input though, then you don't have to think so much about like, well, I have to alter my tool chains or any of those things. It can just be an input that then informs the behavior later on. So rather than thinking about modeling, like writing all the source code in system, it should keep it there. Maybe it's more understanding what the outputs of that process are, and then using those as inputs to how the system needs to change when those inputs change.
Cool. So what does it look like today? You described it tomorrow. We've described it a little bit today, but let's get like exactly what you have on offer.
Yeah. So today it's really ready for the like most DevOps builder of builders, right? So if you're a person who like is an experienced open source developer, you are experienced in building and managing DevOps tools, and you think what I'm talking about is cool, it's ready for you to come and check it out and see if it's as cool as we think it is. And then to talk with us about what's possible and imagine with us about what's possible and write code if you want to make the system do the things you want it to do. Right now, it's mostly good for like deploying containers to EC2, but that's going to change pretty rapidly. The goal is like we'll be increasing lots of that coverage. We'll be open sourcing it right as soon as the customization features are in. So one of the last features we want to add before we open source it is the ability to basically package up your customizations and share them. So if you make a new asset or you add a function to something that already exists, then you can package that up and share it. And then from within System Initiative, you can just install those directly. So once that is landed, we'll open source it, and it'll be ready for those early builders to come and dig in. I don't know that it'll be ready. It'll be a minute before I think it's ready for people to just show up and consume it, right? Because to your point from earlier, there is a lot of coverage that needs to happen. There is a lot of exploration that's needed, but it's ready today and super fun to explore with it and like see what can be built.
Mm-hmm. Is the feature where you can have a production environment and mirror it into System Initiative, is that close or is that near? Is that today? How far away is that?
Yeah, nope. I think it's probably going to be more like toward the end of the year.
Okay. So for now, it's greenfield, brand new, created in System Initiative, merge it elsewhere.
Totally. And I think the work to figure out how to do that bidirectional discovery, it's in flight right now, but the user experience is really the tough part. So thinking about how it works in the under parts, do you know what I mean? Like in the graph is relatively straightforward. Thinking about what the user experience is for letting you choose, that's where the hard stuff is. And, we'll do that through lots of user studies and lots of testing.
So is this a SaaS essentially? Like, will somebody go there whenever it's launched today, essentially to play with it? Do they have to put a credit card in? Is it product-led growth? Is it PLG?
So right now it's actually just, it'll be software you download and you can run it, or source code you check out and compile. It will be SaaS software as well. So the first one will probably be like a bring your own cloud kind of SaaS. And then roughly when that discovery work lands is when we'll turn on full multi-tenant, show up, bring a credit card kind of SaaS, because the onboarding experience will be dope, right?
So dope.
So dope.
Okay.
Cool.
System Initiative. Wow. It's fun being here. Like, we started so many years ago. Was it 2018, Jared? 2019 when we first had Adam on? I was like, I don't remember the first time we had him on.
Don't ask me such difficulties.
It's been a minute.
2021 was the last time, but I don't know what the time before that was.
The War for the Soul of Open Source was July 16th.
2019.
Something with like June and July for you, Adam.
Yeah. Well, it's the time. I think, yeah. I mean, what I was so pleased that you all wanted to talk to me again about this, in part because it's so fun to hang out with you, and your perspectives are always like delightful.
Cool.
And I think the There is something about June and July. I mean, part of it is that it has to be June because if it's July, everybody goes on vacation.
Yeah, forget it, right?
Forget it. You can't do anything
Yeah.
useful.
You want to launch in July? It's like launching on a Friday.
Well, I think OzCon was in July, wasn't it? Like end of July that year? It was this 2019 when we first met you, at least via voice.
Which must have been the last OzCon, right?
It was.
It was, yeah.
What a bummer.
Yeah, it was.
Rest in peace, OzCon.
I know. I was so bummed when they said, like, they never even hesitated. They're like, our whole conferences division is just closed, like immediately. I was like, they must have been waiting for this opportunity. It was opportunistic almost.
And what a sad ending to such an important institution. And I feel like that void's going to get filled, but it does bum me out. Like I said, I was watching that John Allspaw and Paul Hammond talk that they gave at Velocity in 2009. And like, there's so many examples of talks like that and conversations like that they just don't happen anymore. Now they happen on podcasts. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
Yeah.
like now they happen here. And like, that's fun, but it's not the same as going to OzCon.
And I kind of think that's kind of almost better because talks are very one-sided. They're not interactive in most cases. Not that they're bad. It's great to put out like a hypothesis or a thesis or a big vision. But I love these interactions because like you don't just get to rant, Adam. We get to like push back on
We stop you.
some of your ideas. Like, hey, hold on there. It is ka-chow.
It is
know?
100%. And I'm with you. Like, and I would rather prep. I'd rather do this all day than write another talk.
There's room for both.
Yeah.
There's room for both.
Yeah.
Well, I'm being biased here because I love this format. It's just such a
I
great
know you
format.
do.
I mean, people are listening to us right now in the shower. Someone
Right.
is washing their hair.
Yeah. And thinking, I love that show. I'm watching Cars 3.
You like that about
I
it?
hope they looked at their hair in the mirror and were like, ka-chow, you know? I hope they I hope they tossed it back with luscious locks.
Yeah.
Right.
But the point I was getting to was the war for the soul of open source back in 2019. And then, we had this actually predates the Elasticsearch AWS kerfuffle.
Yeah.
The business model of open source, that was in 2021. I was like just paying attention to your tweets. And I'm like, we've got to talk about this on this show. And so we're like, Adam, get back on here and school us. And then here we are back now at the end of that show, as Jared mentioned at the top of the show, was quoting you as talking about system initiative and what your plans were and your vision and like, hey, I'm going to come back on here when it's time. And this is that time. That's what I love about this show.
We're men of our word. We said we'd have you on the show when System Initiative launched. And
here we are.
Dog Nabbit, we're going to do it.
Yeah. Let's get it done.
The loop has been closed.
The loop has in fact been closed. And yeah, I'm so grateful for it. If you couldn't tell from listening to me talk about it, like, I feel like I have like years of like pent up experimentation and like thought that I just haven't been able to share.
Yeah. Well, I asked you about it last time and you're like, I can't talk about it. I was like,
Can't talk about anything.
And like such a bummer. And so like but now I can, and I'm a little overly enthusiastic perhaps about talking about it because there's so much of it. There's like, I could go on forever.
I guess to some degree on that note, this stealth mode idea, it's not uncommon for a startup to be in stealth mode. It's less common these days. What did you like and dislike about this stealth mode you had to be in?
Oh, that's a good question.
And what did it benefit you and what did it take away?
In hindsight, I'm not sure how much it benefited us in hindsight, except if I started talking about the things we thought might be cool. It was such a big swing and there was so little knowledge. I think we probably would have over-rotated to the wrong solution too early because, you'd have been talking about what you thought was right and people would have agreed with you. And it kind of would have taken the art of it sort of off into a direction that resonated with an audience before the art had actually kind of achieved its like full greatness. Not that it's achieved its full greatness now, but do you know what I mean? Like before the album was ready.
It's like describing a painting verbally and you're like, this is an amazing painting. There's hills in this painting and it's just this great sunset, but you can't see it. You can't truly appreciate the artifact.
I think the downside of it is that you do get really pent up about it and really like the pressure kind of builds up on you a little because it's been a long time and you want people to like it. And so a little, I feel like Axl Rose and Chinese Democracy, where it's like, no, I've got this album and some people have seen it and they think it's amazing, and like, maybe it's going to be amazing or maybe it's not. And that album was actually pretty good, but it was like 10 years too late. Like if that album had come out the first time you heard about it, it would have been the greatest album you'd ever heard. And you'd have been like, Axl Rose is amazing. He doesn't need Slash at all. And then like, but 10, 12 years on, you're like, well, so like,
right.
there's definitely risks you run. I think I don't know that I would do it again, be stealthy that long again. But look, if we win and we're right, then everybody will be like, they're geniuses because they stayed stealthily until
You gotta go stealth mode. That's how you win.
you got to go stealth mode until until it's perfect, and then you'll win. And if we're wrong, they'll be like, those dummies. If they'd gotten it to market sooner, they could have known they were wrong and pivoted. And like, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, totally.
But if we win, we're geniuses, and if we lose, we're dummies. And that's just entrepreneurship in a nutshell.
Along that line, the world can change in the meantime as well. In terms of the software world, you know, the game that you're playing can change while you're in stealth mode, especially a long one like you were in.
Yeah.
Of course, you can pivot stealthily because no one knows what you're up to.
Sure.
But was there anything that came out? Yeah, I mean, maybe some of this AI stuff, which I think I did notice in your pitch deck. There was one reference to something, and I thought, it's like machine learning somewhere. You got to have that word in there. Was there any moments where you're like, oh crap, we have to change something?
Oh, there were a million, but they were all because we didn't know how to build it. Like when I say it now,
They weren't from external forces though, they're from internal forces. Like
from external forces.
Yeah, like something happened in the world where you're like, oh
no,
well that's good.
But like that's because it's kind of this. Maybe this is awful, but like it's been a little boring in the DevOps world in the last couple years. You know, like Kubernetes hit like a bomb. What are we doing? Well, you're either on the Kubernetes train or you're not. If you're not, you're like, I don't like YAML or Kubernetes. And if you are, you're like, this is Kubernetes and that's it forever. And okay, you know, like, but we haven't, what's the most innovative thing you've seen in the last 4 years in like infrastructure software? Like variations on themes for sure, but nothing close to Docker or Kubernetes.
Yeah.
You know, like nothing close to like, nothing that where you're like, whoa, you know?
Is this a whoa moment then?
I mean,
do you believe this is a whoa moment?
He wants it to be.
Yeah, I want it to be. But it's not up to me. Yeah? Like, it's up to everybody else.
You know, what do you think's going to happen is what I'm asking. I mean, obviously I know you want it to be a whoa moment. You think, based on everything you know, this is a whoa moment.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I want to win.
I want your affirmative, Adam. I want your full affirmative here.
Yeah, dude, I want the whole thing.
Okay.
Like, yeah, and I think this is it. I think we're right.
Based on what I've seen, I think you could be right. I think, you know, you need this visual interface. This visual interface is really a good thing, I think. The way you connect the dots, this configs update across the board when you make changes. Like, who wants to go and do all that? Like, in the ops world in particular.
No one does. And even if I'm wrong, let's say I'm wrong about System Initiative as an alternate implementation of this system of doing DevOps work. I am not wrong about what happens when we do it the way we do it today. We know what happens. 14 years in, we know this is what happens. And making small incremental changes or putting another layer on top of it or whatever, it's not going to move the needle on the outcomes. It's just not. We have 14 years of evidence that it won't. And so whether it's System Initiative that changes the game or something else, somebody listens to this podcast and they're like, yeah, I've had an idea. I think it should be like this. And then they go build it and they're going to change the game. One of us has to. Someone has to. Or we're just going to admit that this is as good as it gets. Yeah? And then 20 years from now, there'll be some podcast where somebody does the moral equivalent of what John and Paul did and blow everybody's mind. And everybody will be like, oh, it's that way. You know, and I don't know what they'll call it then. Dinosaur ops or something. But
Would you mind if I read a quote from your pitch deck? Is that cool?
Yeah, that's cool.
I don't know who it's from. It's just a quote. It says, way more intuitive with an exclamation point.
Yes.
Way better than having to write custom Terraform providers. Way more powerful and intuitive than the very basic Terraform checks. Better than repo/OPA or OPA or OPA because they still have horrible syntax.
Yeah.
We'll see how this evolves, though.
Yeah.
So very optimistic, and then like, yeah, we'll see.
But that's how everybody should feel about System Initiative.
Right.
That's how you should feel. It's the truth.
Yeah.
And also, it's going to work because you can smell it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like sometimes you're like, oh, yep, this has legs. And like, it's got legs. And I don't know exactly how that works. But the right posture to think about System Initiative is to say, well, how could it scale? What could we do if we had all that information about large enterprises? Like, what could happen? And once you start asking those kinds of questions, it's over in some ways, because now we're doing it together. Now you're in the game. Now you're like, oh yeah, you know, I actually do want to think about what that could be like. Could it be like this? And then it's like, yeah, it could. Because it turns out the way it is was only ever just us talking to each other. What people forget about that conference talk with John and Paul was that I was there, Patrick Dubois was there, Luke Kaniz was there, a bunch of people who started Kubernetes were there, right? We were all there. We were talking to each other. It was like we were feeding into each other. And it's the same loop that's going to happen. And so like once we start talking about the future like that, that's it, right? That's the game.
Okay.
Well, that's exciting.
Let's send some people back to your home base then, systeminit.com. You also have a Discord, I believe. Is that true? You got a Discord that's pretty active?
Well, hopefully it's active. We'd like to become more active because we think people need to talk about this stuff with us and with each other. So that's what we hope that Discord community really becomes.
Okay. Systeminit.com. Check that out. If you're down with Discord, be down with their Discord. And no more paper cuts, right?
God bless us. Yeah, I hope so.
That's it?
That's it.
That's it.
You're all great.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks for coming back.
It's been so awesome seeing you again.
Hit us up when it's open source. We'll help share that as well.
Oh, for sure I will. For sure I will.
We'll put that on news.
Later, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you. You're all great. I'm sorry I have to go.
Just keep telling us that. We'll put that on loop.
That I'm sorry I have to go.
No.
No, that we're great.
Oh, you're incredible. Yeah. Anytime you need it, just call me up and I'll be like,
Okay.
I'll give you sound bites all day. Thanks, guys.
You're great. You're incredible. They love you. That's what Jared and I actually say in the mirror every morning before we get on these microphones and do what we do. It's just like, hey, you're great. You're wonderful. They like you. And that kind of gets us going. I'm kidding, of course. But hey, when we hear this kind of stuff from Adam Jacob or a listener, like it really makes Jared and I and the rest of the team here at changelog.com just giddy, just excited to do this every single day. It's fun. But hey, this call with Adam was amazing. System Initiative out of stealth, ready to go. Systeminit.com. Check it out. The 5-minute demo that we talked about is online. You can see it, you can watch it, you can enjoy it. So do that now. And of course, if you have feedback or thoughts or questions or comments or whatever, the link is in the show notes to comment. Hit us up on Slack. We'll answer on Twitter. We also like a comment on the website, changelog.com/whatever episode this is. The link is in the show notes. And of course, a massive, massive thank you to Fastly, Fly, and also TypeSense. They got our back. You should check them out. And of course, to break Messil into those beats. They're banging. They're the best in the business. We love rocking those beats. From Zelda to Castlevania to Mario Kart to brand new renditions. BMC helps us keep it fresh, and we enjoy it. But that's it. This show is done. We will see you on Friday.